Thank you. This paper I'm going to present is not a clinical paper, although I feel it has a lot of clinical implications. Maybe not so much in individual work, but certainly I think in teamwork. And it is from the perspective of the group and the team that some of the original research that generated these ideas arose. And I was sort of wearing my hat as a educator, and I run seminars for medical students and nursing students and social work students at the medical school and various other centres. And we did we were looking at the way that the different disciplines perceive each other at a student level, and then trying to explore one of the major conundrums of the health service and the problems of the health service at the moment, as I perceive it, as to how to make healthcare teams work, how to move away. We clearly need to move away from the one-on-one work that has characterized the health service clinical area. No one individual and no one discipline any longer can meet the needs of the one single patient, whether he be someone with a stroke or with diabetes or indeed with psychological illness as well, that there is a need to come together in the different disciplines, to work together as a team. And indeed that is part of the buzzword, the current buzzword of a lot of the healthcare changes, are about trying to create what has been called a user-centered seamless service, where there is a sense in which the different disciplines from hospital through into the community will work alongside each other and together for the benefit of the patient. And of course all the research that has been done on teamwork suggests that it reveals a degree of frustration and failure in teamwork. And if you look through the literature on teamwork in healthcare, it often leaves little room for hope, because of the many problems that it seems to arise. And if we look at all the various disasters that hit the headlines from Cleveland to Rochdale and the current ones in Bradford, often the problems are to do with the communications between the different disciplines and the problems that occur between doctors and social workers, psychologists, and often psychotherapists as well. So it's from that basis that I want to kind of present this paper. It is against the background of, I believe, a pressing need for healthcare workers of all disciplines to begin to recognise that they need each other and they need to work alongside each other if we're going to move forward into providing for a health service that is not as fragmented as it was before. The original research I did with the students was we did a couple of exercises over a period of 2 years with them. It's a series of seminars where I would ask them to brainstorm or perceptions about each other. They were divided into the different discipline groups of medical students, social workers and nurses, and we asked them to brainstorm what is it that you think that comes into your mind when you think about a nurse? What is it that comes into your mind when you think about a social worker? What is it that comes into your mind when you think about a medical student doctor? And the three groups had a piece of paper and they had to write down uncensored adjectival phrases. And we collected these over a period of 2 years, in thousands and thousands of papers over quite a number of students, and began to analyse what it is that sort of came out of the perceptions. And the first overhead really illustrates, I think, a summary, and I'll just go through it as a background to the actual paper. Let me try and explain it. See if I've got it right. There we go. That's the perceptions of social worker students by social worker students. So that social worker students thought of other social worker students as overworked, caring, scapegoats, guardian readers, health foods. Medical students, their thoughts of social workers were 2 CVs, left-wing, nosy, intellectual lesbians, caring. Nursing students, overworked, guardian readers, 2 CVs, vegetarians. Medical students thought of medical students as arrogant, underpaid, lazy, heavy drinking, rugby players, naive. And you can see the same pattern. Nursing students thought medical students were arrogant, snobby, overworked rugby players. Nursing students thought nursing students were caring, underpaid, hard work, overworked, apathetic, bicycles. Medical students thought nurses had chips on their shoulders, overworked, underpaid. Social work students thought nurses were hard-worked, unimaginative, gentle, caring, and female. So here we had a set of what I suppose one would call stereotypes. But what was amazing about this piece of research was that first of all, each of the groups seemed to think of each other exactly the same. There wasn't any major difference of the perceptions of themselves as opposed to the perceptions from other groups. And I began to wonder about this, what this meant, that if at this stage of their training, this is what each of the different disciplines thought of each other, what might this mean in terms of the way that the different groups got together to work together. And I began to look through the literature on communication between the different disciplines. And there's been quite a bit of research in this area. But what it all seemed to suggest is that the professional persona that we develop, whatever our discipline of origin is almost created before we enter nursing school, medical school, or social work school. And that the actual training that we get does not seem to shift that much our professional persona, and indeed the perceptions we have of the other professional personas. And I began to wonder, well, crikey, if it happens that early, if it happens even before training starts, what actual sort of option is there for change? And what forces are we dealing with here? Are we dealing with something a little bit stronger than just socialization? Are we dealing with, in fact, archetypal forces? And that's the paper that I want to talk about, because I feel that what we may be dealing with here, and what may explain some of the difficulties that different disciplines get into in groups, have to do with very powerful archetypal forces, which I think, if one begins to at least recognize them, there may be a chance to try and address them. So it's against that background that I'll present the paper on archetypes and the healthcare professions. I hope you won't mind if I read it. I will try and stop every now and again. Archetypes and archetypal formulations are viewed by most observers as one of the hallmarks of Jungian work. Jung's theory of archetypes represented his most important theoretical contribution and hastened his break with Freud. Not only do archetypes characterize Jungian work for outsiders, but they clearly divide Jungians on the inside. The SAP is generally seen as being the least archetypal of the Jungian schools, and Fordham was always cautious regarding an analyst's tendency to relate personal imagery to myth, folklore, or legend. Such a focus, in Fordham's view, can lead to the patient losing contact with the personal context of his unconscious material. And Rycroft, one of the few psychoanalysts well disposed to Jungian ideas, wrote that archetypal formulations can have the feel of highfalutin, portentous language. I have to say I've never quite understood the problem or difficulty with this theoretical area. Jung certainly did not discover them. Similar concepts abound in literature. Plato's notion of original ideas, Bastian's concepts of elementary ideas, Schopenhauer's prototypes, all seem to describe the same thing, same concepts. Within psychoanalysis, Isaac's unconscious fantasy and Bion's preconceptions come close to describing the same phenomena. And more recently, from a different discipline, the ethologists, especially Lorenz and Heidegger, they appeared to identify within animal species behavior patterns that could be considered archetypal. Lorenz talks of innate schemata, that is, certain forms of inborn reaction to characteristic stimulus situations that are independent of experience. Jung's own understanding of the theory of archetypes evolved and continue to change throughout his life. So it's possible to lift several contradictory definitions and statements from his writings, which may explain why so much controversy and debate surrounds this area amongst his followers. Jung was able to say, "Thank God I'm Jung and not a Jungian," and thus avoid the need to defend a particular position. The position that I'd like to take today in relation to archetypal theory is an explanatory one and not necessarily a clinical one. For me, archetypal formulations provide me with an explanatory model that allow me to make more sense of observed and experienced phenomena. Like all explanatory models, it may require to be discarded as new information is obtained. Let me just, I think it's helpful just for me to elaborate what I mean by explanatory models and of observed phenomena. And this may sound terribly simplistic, but for me it just seems to at least help me in my, and I hope it might help some others. We can see observed phenomena of male, female, the shape and size and colour of hair, etc. And the explanatory model is biological, i.e. genetics, and the geneticists will tell us that those observed phenomena are determined by certain genetic patterning. If we look at babies at 3 months, they act in a certain way as a child at 7 as opposed to adolescence. And the psychological and behavioral developmental disciplines will tell us that is an age-dependent phenomenon by and large. If we look at how fathers or husbands act, or wives or mothers, single parents, widowers, again, there are certain patterns of behavior which I think can be explained on socialization models and socialization theories. And similarly, cultural model will explain the patternings and developments and, if you wish, the way that white Anglo-Saxon male may act as opposed to a Bangladeshi or a Chinese. And I believe that there are certain archetypal models which will explain, and I'll elaborate on those words in a moment, certain motifs that occur across cultures and across disciplines. For me, these motifs, there are patterns of human behavior, or patterns of behavior within the human species, which are sufficiently common, occur significantly regularly, are environmentally stable, and exert such a force on human interactions that they act as a template for subsequent experiences. I'll read that again, because I think it explains where I'm coming from, that these archetypal behavioral patterns are sufficiently common, occur significantly regularly, are environmentally stable, and exert such a force on human interactions that they act as a template for subsequent experiences. Within clinical work, Jungians recognize a hierarchy of archetypes: the persona, the shadow, the animus, the anima, and the self, all reasonably well documented. In this paper, I will draw on more mythological themes to explore the motifs of the doctor as the hero warrior god, the nurse as the great mother, the social worker as the scapegoat, and I will introduce the archetype of the trickster to examine the emerging profession of psychotherapy, and finally outline the archetypal motif of the wounded healer or shaman. Well, let's look at the doctor as hero warrior god. The hero as an archetypal motif is probably the most powerfully developed within Western culture and is found throughout history. Essentially, the hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are encountered and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from the mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. That's from Joseph Campbell. From Prometheus to Ulysses, Jason, Christ, Buddha, Hercules, David, the heroic quest has been journeyed on the battleground, up mountains, over oceans, into space, down a microscope, and in an operating theatre. The journey has involved danger, isolation, and death. The basic formula, as identified by Joseph Campbell, is one of separation from the group, the held belief, the known, followed by a period of initiation and a series of trials, and finally the return. Campbell, who writes on the heroic journey, identifies different stages in the journey, which I won't go through in detail, but I suspect you'll all recognize: the separation and departure, call to adventure, the refusal of the call, supernatural aid, the entry into the belly of the whale, then the initiations and trials, the road of the trials, the woman as temptress, finally the return. And I think that if you read his work, and indeed if you read literature, poems, epics, plays, biographies, films, it's very easy to actually identify which aspect of the heroic journey that particular film, play, or biography, or whatever, characterizes. And a lot of Western artistic endeavors are about, if you wish, depicting aspects of the heroic journey. Medicine as a branch of human exploration became a heroic quest very much as the result of the influence of the Greek pantheon of gods and goddesses. It is interesting to trace the disappearance of the goddesses of medicine and healing, which were present in the early history of Western civilization. And notwithstanding the presence of white witches, midwives and nurses, healing and healthcare have always been a male-dominated preserve. In ancient Greece, it was Apollo the sun god and his son Aesculapius who became identified as the father of medicine. Aesculapius was snatched from his mother's womb by Apollo and given to Chiron to bring up. Chiron was the centaur horse. From Chiron, Aesculapius learnt his art and skill and became famous during the Trojan War, as did his two sons, Podaliros, who is the father of internal medicine, and Machaon, who is father of surgery. Aesculapius had a large family, and his two daughters, Hygeia and Panacea, became associated with hygiene and treatment, respectively. The development of the Aesculapian temples in Thessaly gradually spread throughout Greece and Rome, and together with the influence of Hippocrates, formed the foundations of Western medicine. The links between sun god Apollo, the centaur Chiron, the Trojan warrior Aesculapius, and medicine all help to emphasize the aggressive nature of this branch of human endeavor. The language that is used, fighting disease, the battle against cancer, the magic bullet, stamping out infection, cutting out the growth, underpins the view that the practice of medicine is essentially aggressive. Aesculapius was slain by Zeus for daring to raise a man from the dead, thus challenging the gods. Hades had complained to Zeus that his kingdom was being deprived of incumbents by Aesculapius' healing art, and Zeus sent down a thunderbolt to slay this impudent mortal. The agony of Aesculapius' cries reached Zeus's ears, and with the consent of the other gods, Aesculapius was raised from the dead to join the immortal gods himself. Thus the nature of Aesculapius, the god of medicine, his birth and death, with the vivid descriptions of transitions snatched from his dying mother's womb, raised from human physician to immortal god, illustrate graphically how the doctors worked and lived on the boundaries of life and death. The symbolic representation of medicine and its link to mythological themes, I think, is a crucial factor in the development and language that pervades medicine. Aesculapius' symbol of office is the serpent entwined around a staff, which we're all familiar with. But it has emphasized the masculine nature of its craft. Although the cosmology and symbolic significance of the serpent is large, it has primarily become associated with phallic power. The serpent is universally linked to pregnancy, but following the Jewish myth of the Garden of Eden, its link with transformation and rebirth is not so strongly developed within Western cultures as it is found in the East. In the East, the serpent is much more symbolizes transformation. In the West, it much more symbolizes the phallus and energy. Now, the Aesculapian staff is just one snake. I'm sorry, was going to bring an example. One snake round the staff. But the caduceus, which I'll talk about in greater detail, is the symbolic representation which is found in India. This is the symbolic representation of healing as well, which is found in India, Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome, has two snakes. In its full representation, the caduceus was a wand or staff surmounted by two wings and a winged helmet. The wings symbolize transcendence, the wand is power, and the serpent represents healing, poison, and poison. Two serpents, one representing healing or health, the other representing disease and illness. And these are the complementary forces in nature, the union of both sexes, the opposites. The caduceus is the symbol of Mercury and Hermes, and its meaning is not so much related to the individual elements, but to the composite nature of the whole. The Aesculapian staff and solitary snake does not possess the totality of meaning associated with the caduceus, and is linked far more with power and energy than with transformation and complementarity. Thus, the heroic nature of medical advances, transplant surgery, in vitro fertilization, genetic engineering, all challenge the boundary between God and man, the task, or one of the tasks, of the hero in myth and legend. From Adam to Prometheus and Icarus, the task of the hero has been to transcend proper human limits. Hubris is the consequence of this unfettered, heroic activity. So that when medical students are described as beer-drinking, immature, intelligent rugby players, arrogant rugby players, beer-drinking, and God's gift, they can be seen as fulfilling the role not only they, but thousands before them have had ascribed to them by human beings in cultures as diverse as from Greece to India and Egypt. I suspect the rugby playing is the battlefield. The rugby pitch has taken over the battlefield for the medical student of the heroic training of the Greeks. It's actually interesting to note, we did some much more detailed analysis of these, which I've got up here, but it's interesting to note that the opposite, one of the aspects of the masculine archetype is the Puriturnus. And it's interesting to note that the additional set of attributes that were given to medical students were naive, immature, and fit with the as-if personality of the Puriturnus, that denotes an attitude that is innocent of responsibility. See, I would argue that the doctor's use of high-tech medicine, continually challenging the limits of natural phenomena of life and death, is really the archetype of the hero played out in our culture. And it still maintains a great hold on medical behavior and the culture and philosophy of the medical profession. It takes different guises. The consultant, registrar, houseman hierarchy is like the general, field marshal, general, sergeant, straight battle. The ward round is like a parade ground. Everybody's standing up. You've seen it all on telly. And it's true. You only have to walk into the medical school. It's still happening. The constant call for more research and more equipment is against the fight against breast cancer. It's like a call to arms, The model of teamwork, therefore, for most doctors is that of the army. And we see its apotheosis in the operating theatre. And the attempt to move away from this model of teamwork requires a fundamental shift in personal culture and archetypal forces, which I believe for most doctors will prove to be almost impossible. And which may well explain one of the reasons why teamwork is so difficult, if the team is not modelled on the battleground or the army, with the doctor giving the orders and everybody following, which is, of course, what doctors like doing. Right, we move now to the nurse and the Great Mother. The Great Mother forms the central aspect of the archetypal feminine principle. She's seen as the cauldron, vessel, earth, the primordial matrix from which all else emanates. She is thus represented in myths, legends and folklore with the symbols of nature: ponds, oceans, fruit, caves, the great round. The Great Mother archetype has been teased out by Tony Wolfe and includes the mother, the Great Mother, the love goddess, that's Aphrodite, the Amazon and the medium. More graphically, the archetype is there's the aspects of the feminine archetype: the Great Mother, the love goddess, the Amazon, and the medium. And more graphically is the Mother, Madonna, and Whore, which is written about and well described. And we see the constant reemergence of these forms in man's relationship to woman, not only in his fantasy life, but in his real life. Achterberg, in her book Woman as Healer, traces the disappearance of the woman healers and the selective omission of women deities in medical history books. She identifies certain phases of prehistory. Healing was always considered a divine function everywhere, and that only those created in the image of the chief deity were legally and socially permitted to practice. She describes the central position that Inanna, the goddess of healing, had in the Sumerian civilization, and shows how women goddesses initially were present within the Greek Parthenon. She suggests that around 500 BC, the gods of war replaced Mother Earth, and the male cosmologies began to dominate, with the woman relegated to the place of wife and mother. We shall see how this model was re-emphasized by Florence Nightingale in the 19th century and ensured that woman's role in medicine was limited to that of the comforting healer. Female practitioners were few and far between and almost always attracted the opprobrium and disapproval of their male colleagues. Evidence of women as physicians is found in most cultures. They were often the wives or daughters of lower-order wound surgeons. In the 14th century, when the practice of medicine required licensure by examination, there were 15 licensed female practitioners in Germany. And it is only within obstetrics and the practice of midwifery that the women practitioner was initially accepted by the male doctor. Before 1900, the majority of women were attended by other women during childbirth, although attitude towards midwives were often expressed in the most extreme ways by male writers. During the 15th and 16th century, thousands of midwives were burnt at the stake as witches. There's an authoritative volume called Malleus Maleficorum. It's called The Hammer of Witches, written by 2 Franciscan monks, and in detailed procedures as to how such midwives could be identified and persecuted. So there was an attempt to, and there still is, the Wendy Savage, big Wendy Savage debate we had 3-4 years ago is another replay, if you wish, of a not dissimilar phenomena of the male warrior god obstetrician challenging the female Mother Earth approach to childbirth. But nursing profession, which has long and well-established link with the medical profession, is still predominantly a female profession, in spite of rigorous efforts to produce social and professional change in the doctor-nurse relationship. The role of the nurse as the mother-wife servant to the father-husband-master doctor still forms the basis of working relationships observable in most clinical settings. The word nurse itself, with a connotation of mothering and suckling, reflects the link between the role of nursing babies and nursing the sick. The word nurse is derived from the Latin word nutrire, to nourish or to suck, and its link with the 18th century role of the housemaid, situated as it was in a specific class position, and whose responsibilities included the suckling and wet nursing of the children of the great house. So that Florence Nightingale, when she came on the scene, an influence in modern nursing really began around about the Crimean War as a result of the Crimean War. It's very interesting to link major changes in healthcare with the needs of the battleground, which again brings the link back to the doctor as the warrior god. The health service, the Lloyd George Act of 14 or 12, was a direct result of the Boer War because the recruits in the Boer War were found to be totally unfit for fighting. So we had to create a health service to make the population well enough to go to the battleground. There's very well documented parliamentary recordings about that shift. Florence Nightingale clearly came on in the Crimean War. Her influence on nursing reinforced the 20th century approach to nursing, that of the organised housewife, the caring mother, and the obedient servant, exemplified at one at the same time the virtues of the Victorian upper-class woman and her upwardly mobile working sisters. Thorner suggests that the nurse, like the mother, in relation to the infant, caters to the patient's needs and therefore presents the most convenient object of cathexis, on whom the patient may discharge his craving for response as well as aggressive impulses. So the nurse really is back to this notion of the vessel. This situation predisposes the patient to the transference phenomenon of falling in love with the nurse. The Great Mother serves as the most powerful archetype of the feminine. The image and idea of woman as a body vessel is the natural expression of the human experience of the woman bearing the child within her and of man entering into her in the sexual act. The identity of the female personality with the encompassing body vessel in which the child is sheltered belongs to the foundation of feminine existence. Woman is not only the vessel, but like everybody contains something within itself, but both for herself and the male is the life such in which life forms. And this equation, woman equals body equals vessel, generates the most powerful hopes and fears, for which the word nurse often serves as a kind of catch-all carrier. So the nurse carries incredible projections and fantasies about what she is supposed to do, perform. And if you look at the gentle, caring, overworked, underpaid associations of the students to the nurse, they seem to lack the power usually implicit in the image of the Great Mother. But it links very well with the sort of angel of mercy and Madonna and Lady with the Lamp image associated with Florence Nightingale. What is interesting is, as I say, if you look down the associations further down the list, like all archetypes, the Great Mother possesses the elemental negative as well as the positive, as well as the caring, containing vessel. We see the emergence of these negative attributes in the association that the students had of sloppy, cynical, black-stocking, sexy, promiscuous. These were adjectives described of nurses, and this is the shadow side of the Great Mother. We have the picture of Kali here, the devouring Indian goddess, representative of the dark and terrible mother, and which is the opposite of what I've just described. And Menzies Lith, classic paper on nurses and nurses' anxieties. But nurses act as containers for both individual and institutional terror within hospital settings has been well recognised and written about. So the nurse as a figure is the container of the Great Mother, the vessel, as well as, and can be, the devouring, awful, bossy, terrible image that sometimes nurses have as well. Let's move on to the social worker. The shadow archetype, although again very closely linked to Jung's writing, is a concept that can be traced in all major analytic theories. Jung used it almost like a catch-all term to include all that is not conscious. The shadow can thus contain both unfulfilled good as well as unfulfilled bad. And Jung's model of individuation involved the awareness of the shadow side and the ability to contain the opposite poles of both good and evil in full consciousness and thus transcend both. I.e., transcendence involved the complementarity of the opposite poles rather than, as often is played out in our culture and within teams and within disciplines, putting the opposites as antithetical, as at war with each other. Psychologically, however, and most generally, the shadow side is repressed, it's split off, and it's then projected. onto a person, a group, or a foreign culture or belief system. And this process of scapegoating can be found throughout the animal kingdom, although the human beings appear to have developed this process to a fine art. The Nazi persecution of the Jews, the McCarthy hearings in the United States, illustrate how scapegoat psychology determines not only personal behavior, but how it can become a most destructive force for group behavior. The notion that we can transfer our guilt and suffering to some other being who will bear it for us is familiar throughout different cultures. And the scapegoat is the powerful archetype whereby the existence of our shadow can be projected and discharged. We can't put it on them. It's him, it's her, they're awful. It's the blacks, it's the Jews, it's whoever. And within myth and folklore, the scapegoat is often dressed in odd clothes, is linked, usually with a disability or a bodily defect, and sometimes plays the part of the gaudy fool or jester. In literature, the shadow archetype is not as commonly found as the hero, but in the sense that he's the archetypal enemy against the hero, you will find him in most heroic myths. But Faust and Mephistopheles, Jekyll and Hyde, picture of Dorian Gray, another beautiful example of the shadow side, Frankenstein. They're all well-known examples of the shadow in literature. And shadow projection, I think, has a lot to do with unconscious feelings of guilt. Our awareness that we can never live up to these ideal values that we're supposed to, these wonderful, complete beings we're supposed to be, generates the shadow within us. So that I think when social work and social workers began to emerge as a discipline in the idealized decade of the 60s, they were doomed to become the scapegoats of the 80s and 90s. And Barbara Wotton's very good critique of social work linked the emergent profession with the daddy knows best image and accused social work of imposing its own attitudes and values and order on the client. In fact, social work and state authority have to coexist in a complex, intimate, and sometimes fraught dynamic. And Bronowski suggests that the guilt that we feel in the fight against natural chaos, the guilt of society is that it is a society. The guilt is order, and the guilty are those whose authority imposes order. So if social workers are given state authority to impose order, they then generate guilt in those who cannot carry out the ordered behavioral claims that society puts on them. See, there are two powerful ingredients ensure that the social worker is destined to serve as a vehicle for the powerful scapegoat archetype. First is the identification with the outsider. And what is it that they said, what is it that outsiders and scapegoats in literature do? They wear funny clothes. And what is it that everybody said about social workers at the time? Sandals, Guardian readers, sandals, long hair, vegetarians, lesbians, all the outsider kind of linkage. And also this link with state authority. So the students' association with the word scapegoat and the link with state authority is reflected in the nosy, self-opinionated officious. And I don't think it's any wonder that we currently celebrate, like our ancient forefathers, the ritual sacrifice and slaughter of social workers at the moment. In the repeated child abuse inquiries that have become familiar to all of us, from Orkneys to Cleveland to Rochdale, Pindown. And I'm sure that many social workers will recognize the descriptions of ceremonial sacrifice of the scapegoat, which is derived from anthropological literature. I'll just read these two out, it's rather fun. Finally, the scapegoat, hotly pursued by men and women, beatings, gongs and tom-toms, is driven with great haste out of the town or village. I don't know if any of you saw Sue Miller, the social worker in the Orkneys, describe her experience of being chucked out of the Orkneys as a result of her drawing attention to what was going on up there. It's almost identical to that description. So, in my view, if social workers did not exist, we'd indeed need to invent them. Since as a profession, social work is new, if my thesis is correct, social workers must have taken the role of scapegoating from a previous group of unfortunate healthcare workers. And it appears historically that there is some grounds for thinking that this may well be the case. The first recorded execution of the witch occurred around 430 AD, and over the next 2 centuries, thousands were persecuted and killed. It was not until 1736 that the laws against witchcraft were repealed. And I think the midwife then took on the role of the scapegoat. And during the 19th century, it was the itinerant healer who became the butt of all that was wrong with medicine. I suspect that as social workers find their way through the next 2 decades and stop avoiding the scapegoat projections, that the next group will be the alternative therapists and practitioners, which are just beginning to emerge. And what is happening is they're doing exactly the same as the social workers. They're promising that we can do it. You know, homeopathy is the answer, osteopathy is the answer, acupuncture is the answer. And they're creating an idealized hope, which I think will meet with the same difficulties that I think the social workers who were present in the 60s are now experiencing. Well, so the doctor is the hero, warrior, god. The nurse is the great mother. Social worker is the scapegoat. And we now come to the psychotherapist as the trickster. This is a quote from Lopez Pedraza. If we consider psychotherapy to be an adventure, following a Jungian tradition, an adventure into the unconscious, we realize the heroic attitude is superficial to the demands of such an adventure. The one-sidedness of the heroic attitude blocks the unconscious. He identified Hermes as the god of psychotherapy. And Hermes is the friendliest god to man, in fact. He's borderline god, living on the edge. The messenger, the connection maker. His Latin name is Mercury, so he's the slippery, comes in, comes out, quicksilver appearance. Otto writes, it's about Hermes, it is in his nature not to belong to any locality, not to possess any permanent abode. Always he's on the road between here and yonder. Hermes, remember, is identified with the caduceus, the 2 snakes, the wings, the staff, and the earth. The trickster is never far away when Hermes is around. The description of Odin, the Norse trickster god, suggests a mode of operating not unfamiliar to psychotherapeutic work. Odin constantly interfered in the affairs of men, treating them like puppets to bring about the effects that he desired. Generous with gifts at the outset, he withdraws them without compunction when they have done their work. Loki, another Scandinavian trickster god, was noted for his ability to see what is hidden, and having the gift of verbal dexterity, which enabled him to speak in riddles. All these gods have an active, shifty, dubious quality to them, and somehow as psychotherapists we have to allow ourselves to lose our dignity if we are to do our work. As Guggenheim Craig says, the analyst's professional shadow contains not only the charlatan but the false prophet. And the honest psychotherapist is shocked from time to time by the realization that he's been operating completely from the unconscious in his work. And it's interesting to note that what outcome research there is in psychotherapy suggests that the most important factor is the personality of the therapist, rather than his theoretical orientation. And that a global analysis of several studies indicated that the more successful therapists offered a therapeutic relationship characterized by active participation, rather than passive, permissive interpretation. In the larger study of the kind that I know, which was written in a book called The Fifth Profession, it's a study on the personalities of analysts and psychotherapists. Thousands of psychotherapists were interviewed and questioned as to their backgrounds, belief systems, training pathways, and career goals. Certain characteristics emerged, notwithstanding which discipline they came from, or to which theoretical school they allied themselves. They lived on the margins of their culture of origin. Their career mobility was high. Their religious identification was that of an apostate, i.e., those who came from a religious background now identified themselves as either agnostic, atheist, or having no religion. And their political orientation was that of liberalism. These, I think, are the characteristics of Mercury, Hermes, on the edge, neither here nor there. I think it's, I believe, no surprise that many social workers, and I don't know how many social workers there are in this room, escaped into psychotherapy, escaping from the archetype of the scapegoat to the archetype of the trickster. It's quite a common career path. And it's interesting to note when we ask the students which attributes they would wish a team leader to have, the following clusters of adjectives were most common. Good communicator, listens, calm, is cunning, knows a little bit about everything. And when asked which of the disciplines were most likely to possess these attributes, social workers were invariably identified as the possessions of these qualities, clearly, I think, in their trickster aspect of their role rather than in the scapegoat. The emergence of the trickster in the team, however, whether or not in the profession of social worker, may not be, I think, sufficient to enable the warrior god, the great mother, and the scapegoat to live together. I think there's a fifth archetypal image, which is, I think, the earliest one that needs to emerge, and I believe is beginning to emerge, and that is the one of the shaman or the wounded healer. The shaman it's a Tunguistic word. It's found in almost all cultures. His place amongst the tribal group was one of great importance. He was not always male. On occasions he was an ex-patient, although he was equally likely to be the son of a previous shaman. He was often selected as a result of some special occurrence at his birth. He learnt his art through an apprenticeship, which at times was exceedingly hazardous. The role of the shaman was not taken up lightly, for it often involved a descent into the underworld. The shaman's relationship to the patient was complex and took several forms. More often than not, the treatment was not individualized, but directed towards the patient's home, family, or tribe. Healing ceremonies were common, their purpose often to encourage a transformation of consciousness. The shaman would enter into a trance induced through the drinking of some hallucinatory drug or as a result of repetitive chanting or dancing. And whilst in a trance, he would engage with evil spirits that had invaded the patient and transform them, thus ridding the patient of his illness. He was held in awe and maintained his power by surrounding himself, I think, with acolytes and accessories. He acquired his skills through an elaborate training, and they were often made ill by their training. And I think this is an important feature which I'd like to focus on, because I think two special features distinguish the shaman from the previous archetypal images. I think firstly the shaman's relationship to healing was more often to the group than to the individual, and I think this brings me back to my focus on the teamwork. The orchestration of a collective healing ceremony was his role, and I see teamwork in a sense as being the modern equivalent of a collective healing ceremony. At least that's what I think its function needs to be. And secondly, the role of the shaman involved a descent into the underworld, so that it enabled him to confront and come to face his own wounds. Remember that in the training of the shaman, he or she would often become ill. And I think he represents the archetype of the wounded healer in that respect. If we try and link it a little bit to modern ideas, I mean, many doctors and many medical students describe how during the course of their studies, if they are doing neurology and they get a headache, they think it's a brain tumor. If they see a patient with multiple sclerosis or with pins and needles, and they get pins and needles themselves, they think they've got multiple sclerosis. A cough that they develop and lasts more than a week, and they come to you and say, I've got tuberculosis. There's a clear identification during the training period with illness. These internal experiences of illness, I think, are very necessary processes of experiencing wounds without actually being wounded, i.e., it allows the medical student to go through the modern equivalent of a shamanistic training, where he acknowledges his potential for being a patient as well as being a doctor. And it's unfortunate that for the majority, these experiences are regarded as being neurotic, and they're told to grow up and shut up and, be strong, be the hero. It's not good to have wounds. You're not allowed to cry as a doctor. You're not allowed to show your emotions. You've got to be tough. And what happens is that as he develops, the doctor clearly adopts the mantle of only one half of the wounded healer archetype, and that is of the healer, of the hero healer. And the opposite pole, the wounded one, is then projected onto the patient, so that the feelings of weakness, dependency and helplessness are avoided by the doctor or the hero. It's, I think, this splitting of the archetype, or inborn potential of the wounded healer, that helps to produce the one-sided power relationships that occurs and played out in the doctor and patient. And I think also leads and produces the current problem for all healthcare disciplines in the health service, and that is of burnout. And the New York analyst who first used the term burnout as describing the emotional and physical exhaustion he witnessed amongst his healthcare patients. It's now apparent that it's a term is applied to several professional groups. And we can trace and we can look at the burnout amongst healthcare professional groups. And in doctors, and I can quote you figures, doctors are 3 times more likely to commit suicide and have a divorce and are alcoholics than other similar groups. The dropout rate in the nursing profession is even greater. Something like about 30% or 35% stop within a year of their training, an immense wastage. And if you look at that cohort, what is it they do? It's because they cannot take the strain, the stress, the problems of their discipline. And the sense that I have is that it is because this split archetype, in that all the healing is supposedly within a kind of discipline, and all the wounds are projected into the client-patient model. And I just wonder whether we, as psychotherapists and analysts, fare any better. Has our own personal analysis, which is our own descent into the underworld, if you wish, allowed us to come to terms with our own wounds. In fact, it was Jung who first suggested that a personal analysis was the most appropriate way to address this problem. And this was over 70 years ago, and there appears to have been little work to explore whether he's right, whether it is indeed the most appropriate way for us to descend into our underworld. Again, one of the few surveys that has been carried out, over 150 analytically trained healthcare professionals were asked to comment on their personal analyses and rate the general level of satisfaction. A third of them is unqualified dissatisfaction. Now, dissatisfaction does not deny positive gains from analysis, and may indeed suggest that the analysis has actually worked. However, in a further survey of those who went on to have a second and third analysis, one third, a group of mental health professionals who are themselves engaged in the practice of psychotherapy, felt that their analyses did not help them with this issue of the descent into their underworld, facing their own wounds, dealing with their own stuff. I think living with the wound, being aware of the wound, which is what the wounded healer archetype seems to me to signify, implies a recognition of the limitations in each of us and each of our disciplines, and the recognition that if we are to come together to form a group as a healthcare team, I think we need to, as Kane, a nursing tutor, so eloquently phrased it, to develop the ability to delight in another's work and in connecting our own to it. Delight in another's work and connecting our own to it. Now, if you take our own discipline of psychotherapy, it is very difficult, even within the Jungian groups, let alone the Jungian and Freudians and Kleinians, to delight in another's work. We often get into the very competitive area of exchange. And I think it's this living with the wound that typifies the shaman and allows for a level of integration and change that I think is not present in the other archetypal images that I've so far described. And its modern equivalent of the wounded healer, I came across an American professor of urban studies who writes about the reflective practitioner and really traces the problems of professionalization to the focus of late 19th century, 20th century university education, and makes the point that we need to actually create new universities, a new type of professional training to produce what he considers we require to resolve the problems, not just in medicine, not just in psychotherapy, but in urban design, in agriculture and industry. We need to produce the reflective practitioner. And he describes the reflective practitioner like so. He or she recognizes that others have important and relevant knowledge to contribute, and that allowing this to emerge is a source of learning for everyone. Reflective practitioners look for a sense of freedom and a real connection with, rather than distance from, the client. They actively seek out connection with clients' thoughts and feelings, and allow any respect for their own expertise to emerge from discovering it in the situation. I think there's a great need to encourage, develop, foster the reflective practitioner within each of us and within each of our disciplines. And again, I'm now speaking not from the individual clinical point of view of an analytic work, but from my experience in the National Health Service. Because if we are to make sense of the current changes that are going on at the moment, and indeed we do, I think, have a major opportunity to make sense of them, that I would contend that the majority of psychotherapists ought to be working now in the National Health Service, not as psychotherapists, but as leaders of the team, if you wish, as the collective healing ceremony, because I think they possess, of all the different disciplines, the trainings and the qualities that will allow for the reflective process to be present within the team, and therefore allow for the hero, the great mother, and the scapegoat, and the trickster to come together and work together. Thank you very much.